All right, welcome to our video lecture 2. We left off last video lecture talking about three people that were pretty influential in the beginning stages of radio. We talked about Morris, talked about Marconi, and then we started talking about Lee DeForest. And we're going to continue talking about Lee DeForest and some of the things he did and some of the things he experienced, including his ego. But as we get into Lee's invention or inventions or patents into the radio industry, we see our first signs of government intervention. At the time, the government really saw a potential of the radio and what it could do for them and what it could do for their enemies. So as we entered World War I, the U.S. Navy took total control over all radio development to keep total control of it to themselves, and hopefully it won't fall into the hands of the enemy. The U.S. government also took control of all the patents related to any radio technology, and they didn't release it until 1919. And that was kind of a, whether you think government control today is good or not, in some instances it works, and it definitely worked back in World War I. At the end of the war, in 1919, the U.S. government formed a corporation called the RCA Corporation, and the RCA company still exists today. But at its time of inception, the Radio Corporation of America was basically established to help distribute control of the patents back out to the general public. So in your notes, just realize that during World War I, the federal government took control or seized all the patents and all the technology and development of radio, and then in 1990 it formed a corporation called RCA to then redistribute it back out to the general public. Now, Lee DeForest, all the stuff he invented and discovered, he also had to give that up. And it really bothered Lee to do that, but he understood it. Lee kind of had an ego, if you'd say, and we find a lot of egos in this business, in the broadcasting business. But Lee DeForest was probably the first one to have a huge ego in radio and telecommunications. But I want to put here the definition of an ego. Ego is an inflated feeling of pride in your superiority to others. Now, the one thing that Lee DeForest did over the years of his time in radio was he was constantly telling people that he should be considered the father of radio. Now, when you say that you're the father of anything other than your own children, you could probably have a pretty good argument that you have a pretty big ego. And Lee DeForest was one of those. He fought for decades to convince the people in his technical community that he should be and deserved to be known as the father of radio. And I can't think of a better instance of, or a better definition of ego than that. Again, we talked about this, but this is kind of just a reiteration of the notes. He was very interested in voice and music transmission. During the testing phase of the radio telephone, Lee used music to test his radio telephone sets. And during this time, many amateur and professional radio operators, including ships at sea, heard the music, liked listening to it, and actually, at some point, made some requests. It was at this point that Lee DeForest had the idea of mass communications and creating a way to make a profit from this radio telephone industry. Since there was some type of listening demand, people enjoyed listening to it, and he was sending music. It was kind of our first taste of modern day radio, if you will. One of the dates that you need to keep in mind or underline or highlight in your notes, January 12th, 1908, the USS Ohio was sending out big band tunes to other ships out at sea. They were even taking requests. And so this is the date that Lee DeForest considers to be the beginning of broadcasting. At this time, this was when it kind of all started. Prior to that, just never existed. So January 12th, 1908 is considered to be the date that broadcasting actually began. Even though Lee DeForest had a pretty big ego and he considered himself to be the father of radio, and there was a lot of people in the industry that didn't want to give him that title because he basically was self-proclaimed, there's no doubt that DeForest was probably one of the most important individuals in the broadcasting industry at that time, between 1900 and 1920, as far as two-way radio, wireless radio was concerned, and also creating a business atmosphere for this technology. Our next guy, his name is Nathan Stubblefield, and Nathan is considered by the his peers to be the father of broadcasting. He didn't claim to be the father of broadcasting, so we don't have that ego problem here. They gave him the title the father of broadcasting. Many consider Nathan to be the inventor of the precursor of the technology of the cell phone. Now, not even close to the technology that exists today, more so of the method or the madness, if you will, or the thought process of how the signal is transmitted from one end to the receiver. And I'll talk about that in a minute, how that kind of makes sense. In 1892, Nathan was the first person to broadcast a human voice using wireless telephone attached to ground wires or ground electrodes. That's the big distinction between Nathan and Lita Forrest. Nathan actually stuck 2 ground electrodes in the ground, and he used the ground as the conductivity to send his wireless signal through from point A to point B. So he actually used the ground to do that, and it happened in 1892. In 1902, he was credited for the first ship-to-shore wireless telephone broadcast using wires dropped into water. So again, he used 2 different things here. He stuck ground electrodes using the ground to deliver his signal, and then he devised up a way to use the water to actually send his signals. One of the interesting things is one of the first words he used to test his wireless system, he used the words, "Can you hear me now?" And so we now know at this point in our notes that AT&T did not develop that for their ad campaign, and in fact it was Nathan Stubblefield who used the "Can you hear me now" term for the broadcasting of his signal. In 1908, Nathan Stubblefield patented a new version of his wireless telephone designed to communicate with moving vehicles and stagecoaches. We had them both at the time back in that day. Using his ground electrodes, as the vehicle or the stagecoach passed over this area, the signal could be picked up and listened to and then retransmitted actually. So that is like the precursor thought process of modern day cell phone technology. Obviously the technology is totally different. One major problem to Nathan Stubblefield's invention, both the ground electrodes and the wires dropped in water, is there was no way to transmit over long distances. It was a very short distance technology, and so based on that alone, his theories and his inventions basically failed. Nobody really invested in it. People were looking for long distance communications, especially at sea. If you couldn't transmit from 100 or 200 miles apart, what was the point if you had to be within 10 feet or 20 feet or whatever it might be to talk? So that was his major downfall. And because of his failure of his technology and of his inventions, Nathan Stubblefield actually ended up starving himself to death because of that. So kind of a sad end to Mr. Nathan Stubblefield's life. Our next guy, Reginald Fessenden. And Reginald was considered to be the father of radio broadcasting. So we've got a couple fathers here, and I want to make sure you connect the dots with your notes. So when I ask you who is the father of radio broadcasting, who's considered to be the father of radio, and who's the father of broadcasting, you know all the guys' names, and make sure you get them connected. That's kind of one of the first 2 or 3 things that people get wrong on their exam. So just make sure you connect the dots there. Now, Reginald was a Canadian chemist. He was known for his invention of the modulation of radio waves, which became known as the heterodyne principle. And this basically allowed you to receive and transmit a signal on the same aerial, and the aerial is an antenna. So with this heterodyne principle, we were able at this point now to transmit and receive using one antenna, which basically eliminated a lot of the interference in the radio signal. Reginald also was known for discovering amplitude modulation, which amplitude modulation is considered to be AM radio. So now we have the first modern day use of older technology, and we'll talk about FM radio later in our notes coming up. But Reginald actually devised a theory of something also called continuous wave, which is basically a way to superimpose sound waves onto a radio wave. And then once the signal reached your radio receiver or your telephone receiver, things were stripped out, and then you were left with the original sound. So that was kind of a big deal as well. And in 1900, December 23rd of 1900, he transmitted his own voice over the first wireless telephone from Cobb Island in Washington, D.C. Another date here, Christmas Eve of 1906, Reginald transmitted the first radio broadcast in history from Massachusetts, and then ships at sea actually heard him playing "O Holy Night." and reading several passages from the Bible during this Christmas season. So we actually see a use of this technology used to basically entertain people using this technology. Reginald also became the first person to broadcast words and music over radio waves instead of telephones. So we have an instance now where music and words can now be broadcast over radio waves. And again, he was also credited for inventing a system where it could be done by using one antenna. 1906, he was able to achieve two-way voice transmission by radio between Scotland and Massachusetts. Now, just to keep this in perspective, Marconi's transmission was only a one-way transmission using Morse code. Fessenden's way was a two-way transmission, which meant I could send you a signal and you could send me back a signal, and I could talk to you. So that was a major, major breakthrough. One of the things, though, that Reginald faced was the fact that financial backers could not see the potential in his discovery. They thought was primarily that the primary use was just going to be ships talking to other ships at sea, and that there was no benefit to the general public. And so Fessenden really saw that there was a potential for his product in the consumer market and to make a lot of money. Obviously, that later proved to be true, but in the initial stages, he had really a lot of problems trying to find financial backers to back him. We see this happen later, and quite a few years later, with IBM. IBM did not think that anybody would need a personal computer in their home, or nor did they want one. So they basically walked away from the personal computer when it first came out, and so that was a failure of that as well too. So we find that reoccurring in history, where financial backers just really can't see the potential where the inventor did. Okay. We're going to leave it off with those people. In our next set of notes in video lecture 3, we'll talk about one more person, and then we'll get into some other aspects of radio. Now on to our first assignment. You'll be doing a research paper on digital audio broadcasting, or DAB. Your paper has to be 3 full pages, and you must include the answers to the following 6 questions that I've posted here. I will post this on eLearning as well. You must use sources and use the MLA format. Late papers submitted will receive a 10% grade deduction per day. So please make sure to turn your paper in on time.